What a weekend. If you don't know what ordination is, it's a process that, the end of which is where the church recognizes your call to ministry. And they officially, at a very public service, lay hands on you. It was a little weird because he grabbed my head. That's normal. I actually went back and looked at last year's ordination service to just kind of see what was going on and what happened, and so I was anticipating that. And lay a blessing on you. And there are pastors who actually will take the time to trace their path back to who laid hands on that person and that person and that person. And because ultimately, as Europeans, for those of us who are of European descent, it goes back to the Roman Catholic Church. They'll go all the way back to Peter. So we take our place in a long line of people who have been called by God to ministry. And that was what went on Friday night. If you're curious, if you didn't see it, see me after. I'll tell you how to find the ordination service. It was remarkable for me because it was my ordination service, but it was a very good service, wonderful sermon by our district superintendent, Philemon Chambo. I resisted the temptation to make jokes about our names being so similar. And then I regretted it because they call him Philly, and Pastor Carey, who's our district superintendent, and on Saturday morning made a joke about Philly being in Philly. And he handled that fine. So, and I knew he was resisting it because he'd made the comment. So that was the completion of as Pastor said, a very long process. I'm going to tell you the whole story this morning. It's a lot longer than you might think. But I wanted to lay that out. That's what happened. God called me to ministry, and on Friday night, the Church of the Nazarene took the final step of recognizing that call and sending me out to do what God would have me to do. And as much as I was looking forward to that service, and I've been looking forward to it a long time, I wanted to be here. I'm sorry. Because it's been so long, it's been very emotional. I'm going to try and keep it under control for you, but we'll see. We'll laugh. I'll cry. I want to kind of start with a question, though. What's the longest you've ever waited for God to deliver something that you believed He promised you? A year? 5? 20? 30, and you're still counting? God has His own sense of timing, and it's perfect, and it's hard to remember that. And so the verse that I've kind of laid as a foundation for the sermon, I'm going to tell you I'm breaking rules this morning. I never preach sitting down. I'm going to do that for a while because I want you to be comfortable as I tell my story. Even my Sunday school class, the only time they've ever seen me sit down to teach is when I had my knees replaced and I couldn't stand for an hour. Another one is I never take verses out of context, and I did. I kind of plucked one out this morning because it works for me. I encourage you to go back and read the context and see how it actually fits. But it's Psalm 31:24. It says, "Be strong and take heart, all you who hope in the Lord. Because no matter how long you wait, He is our hope." There are things I waited a long time for. My parents' salvation. I didn't even know what happened for my mom. She told me about it later. Hi, Mom. Mom worships with us online every week. She's very faithful. And I know she's online. I was back in my office, and I had just forgotten something, and Janet was chatting with her. I waited for my dad, and he was stubborn. Literally on his deathbed. He was dying, and we knew he was dying, and I called the pastor down in Newport Richey, Florida, and said, "Hey, can you stop in and see my dad?" And they couldn't even have a proper conversation, but he talked to him and shared the gospel with him and prayed with him, and my dad, he nodded assent that he'd prayed that prayer, and so wow, long times. But my story this morning goes back even further than that. I was kind of a weird kid. I was that kid who liked school. Um, so you think I'm weird. Pastor John tells me I'm weird every now and again. I was that weird kid who liked school, and I liked church. In fact, we hit a point before I hit my teen years where my whole family just quit going to church. I don't remember what happened. I'm sure my mom can fill me in later if she cares to. But everybody quit going to church. And they just kind of, okay, you want to go, get up and go. And I got up and went. Even changed churches once on my own, just because my best friend's dad started a new Boy Scout troop, and we went to a different church. I was raised Lutheran, and I switched over to the United Church of Christ. Had nothing to do with church. Like I said, it was just where my scout troop was at. And one Sunday, pastor said, we're gonna have Boy Scout Sunday. That's a thing with the scouts that meet in churches. And we're gonna give you all a chance to do a little 5-minute sermon. Scared the daylights out of me, because I'd never spoken in public. I was like 12 years old. What do I know? I had no idea how to write a sermon, and pastor gave us no help. He just said, this is your thing, go. So I went home and talked to my dad about it. And my dad, he'd been mad at church for years. I don't know what happened. He was mad at churches. He had no quarter for pastors. So he wrote a sermon for me. Can you imagine what that would look like? And I'm still today even kind of a people pleaser. And here I am caught between my pastor who wants me to preach something that's nice and my dad who wrote this angry sermon for me. But I did it. And I preached it in a way that people were responsive to it. And I knew that day, after 5 minutes, I was going to be a pastor someday. I wasn't too sure about what the church I was in, though, because not too long after that, pastor took us on a little field trip down to Lancaster Theological Seminary. Don't mix up the Bible college and the seminary. They're separate, and they're not alike. And this would have been in the 1970s for those of you whose life began in the 21st century. Dinosaurs did not still roam the earth in the 70s. They were gone by then. But the fashionable theology at that point was liberation theology, and I didn't know what that was. I just knew it sounded really weird, and that was not my path. It was really weird, and it's only gotten worse since then. But that was not my path. And as I'm going through my teen years, I'd run across little gospel tracts, and I go back to my pastor and tell me, what's this born again stuff about? And he'd just go, oh, well, different Christians believe different things and use different words, and that was all the answer he ever gave me. Okay, whatever. I got to high school. My first year at Reading High, yeah, I'm a local kid. I've been in Reading almost my whole life. I went to the Bible club just to be nosy. I didn't know the teacher who sponsored the club, and I didn't know any of the kids, so I didn't go back. These kids chased me through Reading High for 3 years. Okay. For those of you who are little, none of you are little, who are younger, when I was in high school was 3 years. Junior high was 3 years, elementary school was through 6. Doesn't matter. That's why they chased me. And they wore these big red buttons, said, get smart, get saved. And I'm like, why are you people chasing me around? Leave me alone. I go to church every Sunday. And I went back to my pastor with more questions, and he never really answered them. And I think it was a God thing. He wouldn't have thought so. And I understand he was a wonderful man. I don't know if he's still alive or not. I saw he retired a number of years ago. But he was a wonderful man. I loved him. We did interesting things. I was always given a chance to do everything that teenagers got to do in the church. And I got to ring the bell. They had a church bell. That's an exciting thing because it's heavy. It'll lift you off the ground if you're not careful. I wasn't heavy then. I was never a skinny kid, but I wasn't, real heavy. But I couldn't see where God was going. But God is faithful. And I started on this path. And I will tell you, I'm really glad that he never answered the question. Because if he'd actually gone into the theology behind his opinions, I'd have been satisfied. Because they were rational. They're wrong, but they're rational. I graduated from high school. Well, as I was approaching graduation, I knew I didn't have money to go to college. I had no idea. I didn't actually talk to my pastor about going into the ministry, so I didn't even know really what that process was, except I knew that seminary was a postgraduate degree, and I didn't know how I was going to pay for college. So I wanted to enlist in the Navy. Anchors away, my boys, anchors away. Confused my poor parents that their gentle son, who was such a nice church-going boy, wanted to join the military. They went along with it. They had to sign my paperwork. I wasn't brilliant that I graduated at 17. My birthday's late in the year, and back at that point, if your parents wanted, they would start you when you were 4. So I graduated at 17, and I joined the Navy with a contract guarantee. I was going to be a Navy translator. Got to study Korean, which is easier than Chinese, but harder than English, if you want to put it in. They actually class the languages, and English is like a class 3 language. They go from 1 to 4. English is such a mutt language, it's hard to learn because the rules don't make sense. If you ever want to see something funny, oh, no, I can't remember his name. I'm sorry. There's a comedian who does a whole stick on English pronunciation and different things. I'll remember his name later. Ask me after the service. It'll come to me. But so I'm learning Korean. And while I was at the Defense Language Institute, which is where everybody in all the services go to learn languages, I was met by 3 friends who all went to the same church. 2 of them were in my unit, were Navy guys. One was an Air Force airman. And they came and they invited me to church a couple of times, and I kind of blew them off. I'd never heard of the Church of the Nazarene, didn't know who they were and what they stood for, and I was kind of trying to sort myself out. I was 18 years old. Everybody 18 is trying to sort themselves out. And then he started asking me, well, are you a Christian? And because I'd never gotten solid answers from my pastor, the best answer I could give was, well, I think so. I think so. And one week they said, look, we're singing special music this week. Come hear us sing. I didn't know what special music was either. I'm convinced it was a curse on the church, and I'm glad it went away. But they sang this old gospel tune called The Lighthouse. Now, this church is a remarkable thing. Their sanctuary was a little bit bigger than this, but it was shaped, I think it was octagonal. So you either had 6 sides or 8, I forget. And all the walls came to a point in the ceiling, and there's this big skylight in the ceiling, a beautiful place. But it was an ugly, rainy morning. The weather was terrible. We're in, the Defense Language Institute is in Monterey, California. It's a nice area. They start singing this song, and they get to the chorus, and the chorus goes, and I thank God for the lighthouse. And lightning rips across the sky, and the lights went out. I'm coming back. And I came back, and all the questions that I had gone to my pastor with as a teenager got answered over the next 6, 8, 10 weeks by that pastor about what did it mean to be born again? What was all this stuff I was reading in these tracts? And they gave an altar call. And if you don't know what an altar call is, in our tradition, this is an altar. And they would call you up and say, come on up and pray, and we'll pray for you. And I didn't know any fancy sinner's prayers. And the only prayers that I had actually prayed beyond very immature prayers, because I'd never been taught to pray, were the ones that we recited in the liturgy at church. And so I looked back at my friends from the altar and said, Jesus, if you're real, make me like them. Because they had lived it out in front of me. I heard a description of that later by a storyteller named Mike Warnke. He had problems, but he tells this story because he was also saved in Navy boot camp. I was out of boot camp by this point, but this related with me both being Navy vets. And he says, when he prayed his prayer, Jesus reached down and he says, he touched me and he killed me and he raised me from the dead. And I'm going to say this, as important as my story is to me, And yes, you have to listen to the whole story. Hear this, because this is the most important thing I'm going to say to you today. I could have gone into this and said, I would go to church my whole life. When no one took me to church, I got up and went to church on Sunday morning. When I was working stupid hours at McDonald's and was tired on Sunday morning, I got up and went to church on Sunday morning. Of course I'm a Christian. And I could have faked it because I was a nice guy. I was my Nana's favorite child. You're not supposed to have favorites, but all my siblings will tell you I was Nana's favorite. And her thing always to me was, be a nice boy, Scotty. Be a nice boy. And I wanted to make my Nana happy, so I was a nice boy. And I could have fit in. I could have come to church on Sunday. I could have sung the hymns once I learned them because we didn't sing the same hymns. And I could have played at the game. I could have played some kind of plastic fake Jesus game. And nobody would have known the difference. If that's you this morning, and if you sit under Pastor John's preaching and that's you this morning, you're stubborn. You're really stubborn. If you're worshiping online and you've not heard this before, or if you catch the sermon later on in the week and you wonder what it means to be a Christian, it's not about giving assent to a set of doctrines. It's not about feeling nice about Jesus. It's not about going to church and putting money in the offering plate, although I encourage you to do both of those things because those are acts of worship. It's not real. It's not real. And God knows real. When Jesus told Nicodemus what it meant to be a Christian, he told him, you must be born again. I listen to people talk about, how could a loving God send someone to hell because they don't believe what he wants them to believe? It's like, you don't understand. God's trying to rescue us. We're already headed for hell. It's not about our choice. It's not like he's going, how did you choose, left or right? No. Are you spiritually alive? Have you had that experience? If you haven't, it's fake. And why would you want fake? There are things about my life before I was saved and after I was saved that were not different. I didn't drink. I didn't do drugs. I swore for about 10 weeks because I went to boot camp and I learned to talk like a sailor. I came home on leave after boot camp and talked to some of my friends and they just looked at me like I'd grown a second head. And it's like, okay, I don't need to do that. I don't need to talk like that. None of the rest of my story would have happened if that real thing hadn't happened. Now, the things did change. The things I talked about changed. That's my family. My mom still talks about I didn't own a car when I went to college, and so she would drive me from Reading up to school, or one of my brothers would drive me back and forth, and I would preach the whole time. My mom still kids me about it, but she got saved, so it's okay. So I spent some time in the Navy, and then I got an ROTC scholarship and headed off to college. ROTC didn't work out. But in fact, neither did college. But let me not get too far ahead of my story. But I got saved in a Nazarene church. So when I got to Penn State College, I hunted up the Nazarene Church. And my Sunday school teacher there was the navigators rep at Penn State. If you don't know who navigators are, that's fine. It's a discipleship ministry. And so Roger, if you happen to see this service, I don't think you will, but if you do, you were key. I did want to leave out that guy that was in the Air Force that invited me. He was actually the one who was most influential in my being saved. I'm not going to tell you his name because, funny story, he was running from a call to preach and was very open about it. He's a preacher's kid, and he said, I saw how churches treated my dad, and I don't have anything to do with it. So he joined the Air Force, studied Russian. Do you know what he did after he spent his 20 years in the Air Force? He was a missionary to the Ukraine, where he used his Russian language training. Yeah, try and fool God. That ain't going to work. But I won't share his name, not because I can't remember it as often as that happens, but because the last time I heard, he was working in a country that doesn't allow missionaries. So I know his name. If he hears this sermon, he'll recognize his role. Roger, God bless him. He said, he saw something in me that I did not see in myself. He said, would you be my assistant Sunday school teacher? I'll give you help and we'll do that. And I think we were together for about a year. I had never really taught anything except in boot camp. That was a funny thing. We had somebody whose job was to tutor recruits going through boot camp, because in Navy boot camp you take a lot of book tests. And I had this crowd that I had developed that was bigger than the educational petty officers group. That got me a promotion from E1 to E2. Okay, big deal. But that was the first time I'd ever seen teaching in my own life. But Roger, he brought me in, and I did a little bit of teaching, and then he abandoned me. Just to show you God has a sense of humor. He took a position somewhere else at another campus and left me there with this Sunday school class of people my own age. It was a young adult class, so it was all single people in their late teens, early 20s. And there I was teaching, still trying to figure out what spiritual gifts were, because I had only been a Christian for about 2 years at this point. And, there's a lot to learn to be a mature believer. And I felt abandoned. I didn't feel like I had been promoted or treated as something special, but God used that to start to reveal to me what my spiritual gifts were. So I guess my next little tidbit that I'll drop here is, do something. Find your place in the church. Try things out. They may not work. It's okay. If you try something and it's not for you, we're going to pray for you. Thank you for your effort, and find another place for you. Amen. Don't come in and worship and go home. Again, why would you settle for less than what God has prepared you for? I did have a lot of significant experiences in State College. I was going to offer a couple of apologies at the beginning, and I didn't. I even have it in my notes, and I didn't. First, apologies to folks who've known me for a while, because you're going to hear some of these stories that you've heard before, because I'm old and I tell the same stories over and over again. And some are personal, but they're personal for me. I'm not out to embarrass anybody. I say that because there was this little boy that I met at church, about 9 years old, and we really hit it off. And I'm usually good with kids about that point. Younger than that, I scare them. I do. You watch me with the kids out here, they just run away. They don't cry and scream, but they don't usually, I don't know. But around that age, I tend to connect a little bit. And I had a digital watch when they first got cheap that played Fur Elise, and we played with the watch and had fun, and I made a connection to his parents. And he had an older brother that had just been discharged from the Navy. He had some medical issues that they caused. He got hurt in boot camp, and they discharged him. He was having issues, and he said, his parents invited me home to dinner and said, could you come and meet with Bill and see if we can help him get over this? Well, Bill bailed. And the little boy had a big sister who did not want me there for dinner. She worked on Sunday mornings in a restaurant, and she just wanted to take a nap, and I didn't know when to go home. Her parents, her parents' gift was hospitality, and they would take pity on poor college students who didn't have home-cooked meals. So I had this wonderful home-cooked meal, and the little kid I'm playing with, and the big sister who was annoyed, and just, so I'm not looking at the back of the room, and just wanted me to go home. And there was a point, kid's name is Dave. He knows his name. We're playing, and she just got on, and hands on her hips about something that Dave and I had done. And I looked at this woman and said, she is fabulous. I want to get to know her better. And I chased her. And this was not one of those I pursued her till she caught me kind of things. Oh no, I had to win her over because she did not like me at all. But I married her. And just in case you're curious, I've only been married once to the same woman. And this summer, that'll be 42 years that we've been married. So, At this same church, I had a pastor who recognized that call to ministry. The first step in the call to ministry when you work things out with your pastor is what's called a local minister's license. They used to be called local preacher's licenses. This is this one. I know you can't read it out there, but that's fine. This is my local preacher's license. It's dated 1981. Okay, so I was called to preach at 12. I started that process in 1981. I won't to go through that whole story because I'm long and I've got a lot to go yet. But that didn't work out. Pastors, we had an experience, and pastor said, I'm going to recommend the board not renew your license, and they didn't. And I think that was a blessing, because I think if I'd been ordained in my 20s, I'd have been much less effective than if I was ordained in my 60s. I didn't appreciate that in my 20s. I didn't see what God was doing, but God is faithful. And then college kind of fell through. I lost a grant that I had used to pay for two terms tuition. So I left school owing the government money and owing Penn State money. So I couldn't get my transcript, because that's what they do. If you owe the money, you don't get your transcript. So you can't do anything. Well, and I did the normal stuff. I was married, we had kids. I wrenched my family away from beautiful Happy Valley and brought them back to Redding. And I don't mean Redding area, I mean Redding, because this is home and it was cheaper than anywhere else. And we went through all normal family stuff. I taught Sunday school when I had chance. I taught little kids. That was an adventure. I taught old people. That was a bigger adventure. Because they had been, I had to ask my pastor for help on this, because they would just sit and look at me. And I'm like, I've never had this experience with teaching where people just sit and look. And it was just, he came, wise man, he came to me and said, look, they were raised at a time when kids were taught to sit and be attentive and respectful. And so, okay, and I did, people, if you were in my Sunday school class when I first came here, and there's a couple of you who were, it would be go like this, just anything to get a response from them. And then that church closed, and I came here. Time compression is an odd thing. I've been here almost 30 years. There are like half a dozen of you here who are here longer than me. I couldn't pursue the ministry because you have to have your transcript. Poor Dave Watts. Dave Watts was the pastor here when I came here. He was at my ordination service, saw me Saturday morning and said, I never saw this in you. I'm sorry. And I said, no, you got to understand, I couldn't have done it. I couldn't. I didn't see what God was doing, but God is faithful. Amen. So I just went on with my life, and I taught. I mean, that was my gift. I don't see it, but people do. And so I've been a teacher here for most of 30 years. And then finally I hit a point where my student loans were paid off. My old tuition to Penn State was paid off, and I could go back to college. And I thought about Bible college, and Pastor talks about what a mess things were here. This was before he got here. And we didn't even have a pastor. They would send in people who'd be here for a while, and then they'd leave, and they'd be here for a while, and then they'd leave. And going into the ministry just didn't. Why? What about what was going on here commended that? I didn't know what God was doing, but He is faithful. Yes. So I pursued. I sought out different degrees that interested me. Some were plainly not going to work. I thought about going for secondary education. I would have loved to have been a high school history teacher, but I had a day job, and you can't study education at night. It doesn't work. You got to student teach at some point. I had actually studied accounting a little bit at one point, completed a certificate program, but you can't, around here, you can't study accounting at night either. And I had an interest in computers and technology, and you can get, if you go to Penn State Berks, you can get your degree in information sciences and technology at night. So it's like, okay. This is it. So I got my degree in information sciences and technology. I had been a dispatcher before that at a company that processed medical waste. And I got when I graduated, I had my first IT position. I was going to go work for a web hosting service up near Allentown. And I was excited. I resigned the job and went to the new job. And this is at a time when the economy was terrible. It was the end of the Bush years, beginning of the Obama years. And if you remember, it was awful. So I was happy to have this job. I got to the end of my probation. You had to take a test. And I had failed the test twice. And they escorted me out of the building. I mean, they called me in, said, okay, you failed the test, sorry, bye. Is there anybody you want to say goodbye to? And they walked me to my desk so I could get my stuff and walked me out of the building. And I was unemployed for almost 2 years. I did not know what God was doing, but God is faithful. Amen. And by this time, John Letterman was our pastor, and he called me into his office one day and said, Scott, I know why you're having trouble finding a job. And I'm like, okay, smart guy. Why can't I find a job? And he said, it's because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You need to go to seminary. He did not have to twist my arm. I applied to seminary, Evangelical up in Myerstown. Got accepted. Seminary is expensive. And I just kind of got on my knees and said, Lord, if this is your thing, you've got a tuition bill to pay because I don't have it. And I applied for every loan, scholarship, grant, $200. I managed that wouldn't cover books for a term. I got the folks at Evangelical to give me another term to raise funds. Nothing. I did not know what God was doing, but God is faithful. Now, in the Church of the Nazarene, they do not require a master's of divinity for ordination. We do have our own process. So we got me a local minister's license, the modern version of this one, and I enrolled at Nazarene Bible College. Got my first district license. I got 8 of them, 7 of them. That's what this other one is. This is my very last district license. At that point, for anyone who might be confused, at that point you are pastor. I could marry, bury, preach. If I was called to it, I could have pastored a church. It was a long process, though, especially when 2 years ago I applied for ordination, and I was in the process. There's something called the Holiness Symposium, which is a step that we do in the Philadelphia district. And I got a phone call from the head of the board of ministry that right before my ordination interview and said, Scott, you filled out this form. We have to fill out an application for that district license every year. And the first 2 years you filled it out, you filled out your role as student. Now, one of the requirements for ordination is the equivalent of 3 years of full-time ministerial service. Student doesn't count. I checked the wrong box. It's not like I was away at school. I was here. I had to wait 2 more years. I did not know what God was doing. But God is faithful. And here we are. An end. And it's not like graduation from high school or college. That really is an end. They'll tell you it's a beginning, but it's a completion of a process that doesn't have a next step, really. I mean, you could pursue further education, but there's no real next step. But this is a recognition on the leadership of the church's behalf that this is God's calling on my life. And so today we are at a beginning. It's an odd kind of beginning because I'm not doing anything today that I didn't do last week or the week before. But it is a beginning. And life is going to be full of all kinds of beginnings. As they come up, there is one other, not a person, but a group of people I'd like to kind of call out and recognize, because I serve. And I've never been confused about that. I serve. If people didn't come and hear me teach, and people didn't come and hear me preach, I'd be in front of an empty room. And I'd have been in front of an empty room for over 30 years. If you folks were not part of what I do, I'd be sitting in a pew, singing happy songs, throwing money in an offering plate, and wondering why I was in church on Sunday morning. But here we are. I am an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene, recognized by not just the folks here who've known me for so long and have been supportive, but by people who would see me once a year maybe and ask me questions that were of significance to them and not necessarily to you. But what a future we have. I don't know what it is. God knows the end from the beginning. I don't. But God bless us all that we are here. And so I asked them very last minute, I thank these guys because they were just wonderful and fell in place. God, you've done something wonderful before. Would you do it again? Do it again.
Hey, thank you for watching, listening, and subscribing. Our hope is that this content will point to the person who can heal and transform your life. That person is Jesus. If you would like to learn more about him and how to become healthy in every area of your life, we would like to give you access to Right Now Media. This is the world's largest video streaming library of biblical resources and entertainment. It's completely free. We already paid this subscription for you. Scan the QR code if you're watching, or find the link in the description below. Again, thank you for being here. We'll see you next time.